The moment that would be remembered as the end of the Galactic Civil War didn't happen with a massive battle or a dramatic surrender. It happened during a quiet conversation between two old soldiers, who had spent their entire lives killing each other, Admiral Vextar and Fleet Commander Zaranith stood together on the observation deck of the neutral human vessel Unity, looking out at the assembled fleets of both alliances. For the first time in 2 centuries, Korathi and Zilani ships were positioned side by side rather than in opposition. The sight was so unprecedented that many of the crew members from both sides simply stared in wonder. "I remember," Vextar said slowly, his universal translator converting his words for Zaranith to understand. "When I was young, my grandfather told me stories about the time before the war. He spoke of Zilani artists who came to our worlds to share their crystal symphonies. I thought they were just old stories, perhaps even lies." Zaranith's crystalline features shimmered with what humans had learned to recognize as Zilani sadness. "My people have similar stories. Korathi engineers who helped us build our first quantum computers. Our children learned that such cooperation was impossible, that your people have always been our enemies. But the humans showed us records from before the war. The cooperation was real." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead human mediator, watched this exchange with carefully controlled emotion. 3 months of intensive negotiations had led to this moment, but the breakthrough had come from something much simpler than complex diplomatic agreements. It had come from helping 2 civilizations remember who they had been before they became defined by war. The process had not been easy. Every step forward had been met with resistance from hardliners on both sides, who believed that peace was either impossible or undesirable. Military leaders who had never known anything but war struggled to imagine their role in a peaceful galaxy. Politicians whose careers were built on wartime, emergency powers resisted any change that might diminish their authority, but humanity's approach had been unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of trying to impose solutions from outside, human negotiators had worked tirelessly to help each species rediscover their own reasons for wanting peace. Captain Lisa Thompson, a former hostage negotiator from the London Metropolitan Police, had spent weeks working with Vecthar, hive queens, to help them understand that their swarm's survival instincts could be better served through cooperation than constant warfare. The insectoid species had evolved in an environment where resources were scarce and competition was fierce, but humans helped them see that in the vastness of space, there was abundance enough for all. Dr. Kofi Asante, a cultural anthropologist, had made the critical breakthrough with the energy beings known as the Lumina. These creatures existed in a state of pure thought and had joined the war because they found the electromagnetic patterns of battle aesthetically pleasing. It took Asante weeks to understand their perspective, and then more weeks to introduce them to human music, art, and literature, showing them that there were forms of beauty that didn't require destruction. Each species had their own story, their own reasons for continuing a war that no longer served any rational purpose. The Granite Lords fought because their ancient honor codes demanded they fulfill their alliance obligations. The Merton fought because their complex social hierarchies were built around military achievement. Every single civilization involved had become trapped in patterns of thinking that made peace seem impossible, but humans specialized in seeing patterns and breaking them. Professor Sarah Kim, a game theorist from MIT, had identified the crucial insight. "They're not really fighting a war anymore," she explained to the human strategy team. "They're performing a war. It's become a cultural ritual that they're all afraid to stop because they've forgotten how to define themselves any other way." This understanding led to humanity's most innovative intervention. Rather than trying to stop the war through force or negotiation, they began working to help each species imagine new ways to define their identity and purpose. The breakthrough with the Korathi came when human historians helped them rediscover their pre-war achievements in terraforming and ecological engineering. Before the conflict, the Korathi had been known throughout the galaxy as master world builders who could transform barren planets into thriving ecosystems. Centuries of war had reduced them to viewing their engineering skills solely in terms of building better weapons and fortifications. Dr. James Wilson, an environmental engineer, spent months working with Korathi scientists to design theoretical projects for rehabilitating war-damaged worlds. For the first time in generations, young Korathi began to dream of creation rather than destruction. The Zilani breakthrough was different but equally profound. Their civilization had originally been built around the pursuit of knowledge and artistic expression. The war had perverted these drives into a relentless focus on military technology and propaganda. Dr. Maria Santos, a philosopher and former UN Secretary-General, helped Zilani intellectuals reconnect with their species' original purpose by introducing them to human scientific and artistic achievements. "Look," she said during one crucial session, "at what a young species like humanity has accomplished in just a few centuries of peace. Imagine what your people could achieve if you turned your magnificent minds toward creation rather than destruction." The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when old hatreds and suspicions threatened to derail the entire process. Radical factions on both sides attempted to sabotage the negotiations through terrorist attacks and assassination attempts. Some hardliners argued that the humans were manipulating both alliances for their own mysterious purposes, but something had changed in the fundamental dynamic of the conflict. For 2 centuries, every action had provoked an equal and opposite reaction, maintaining a perfect balance of destruction. The human presence introduced a new variable that broke this pattern. For every violent incident, there were now voices calling for restraint. For every setback, there were examples of successful cooperation to point to. Admiral Chun Wei, commander of the small human peacekeeping fleet, found himself in the extraordinary position of mediating between starships that had been designed to destroy each other. His background in UN peacekeeping operations had prepared him for complex multinational challenges, but nothing in human experience compared to this. "The key moment," he would later write in his memoirs, "came when we stopped trying to end their war and started helping them remember why they might want peace." The formal ceasefire was signed aboard the human vessel Hopes. Dawn in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy. Representatives from 47 different species gathered in a specially constructed chamber that accommodated the wildly different environmental needs of each delegation. The Merton required specialized water-breathing apparatus. The Lumina existed as contained energy fields, and the Granite Lords needed structural reinforcement to support their massive forms, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about the ceremony was how ordinary it felt. After months of human-mediated contact, former enemies had begun to rediscover the commonalities that had once made galactic civilization possible. Korathi engineers found themselves fascinated by Zilani quantum calculations. Zilani artists were inspired by the geometric patterns of Vecthar architecture. Old friendships were renewed and new ones were formed. The peace agreement itself was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than complex territorial divisions or war reparations, the document focused on positive commitments for the future. Each species pledged to redirect their military research capabilities toward projects that would benefit galactic civilization. Contested territories would be jointly administered by multinational councils. Most importantly, a permanent peacekeeping force would be established with human observers to help prevent future conflicts from escalating, but the real change was deeper than any formal agreement. The galaxy had remembered something it had forgotten during 2 centuries of war. That cooperation was more powerful than conflict. That diversity was a strength rather than a threat, and that the universe was vast enough for all to find their place. In the months that followed, the transformation was remarkable. Weapons factories were converted to civilian production. Military academies began teaching diplomatic and scientific subjects alongside tactics and strategy. Young people who had grown up expecting to spend their lives as soldiers began to dream of careers as explorers, scientists, and artists. Dr. Sarah Chung, now head of the Galactic Peace Initiative, stood once again in her old laboratory on Earth. Looking up at stars that no longer hid battlefields, Humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had ended a war not through superior force, but through superior understanding. The irony was not lost on her. Humans, the youngest spacefaring species in the galaxy, had succeeded where ancient civilizations had failed because they brought a fundamentally different perspective. Where others saw enemies to be defeated, humans saw problems to be solved. Where others saw permanent conflict, humans saw temporary disagreement that could be resolved through patience and creativity. Ambassador Cathryan of the Neutral Covenant, now serving as the first Director Gen. 6 months after first detecting the alien signals, humanity had transformed from a species taking tentative steps into space to a civilization preparing for contact with a galaxy at war. The revelation that massive interstellar conflicts were raging just beyond their reach had united Earth's nations in a way that no earthly crisis ever had. General Patricia Morrison stood before the assembled United Nations Emergency Council in a briefing room that hadn't existed a year ago. The walls displayed holographic representations of the galactic battlefields, painstakingly reconstructed from intercepted communications and sensor data. The scale of the conflict was difficult for human minds to comprehend. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of humanity's future, "our latest intelligence indicates that this galactic civil war has been ongoing for over 200 years. Conservative estimates suggest that trillions of sapient beings have died in the conflict. Entire star systems have been rendered uninhabitable." The Brazilian representative leaned forward in his chair. "General, what are our options? Can we simply avoid contact until they destroy each other?" Morrison shook her head grimly. "Our xenobiologists and military strategists have run every scenario. The war is spreading outward. At current expansion rates, it will reach our local stellar neighborhood within 50 years. We have two choices: engage now while we have some element of surprise, or wait and face whoever emerges victorious from a position of weakness." What the general didn't mention, what kept her awake at night, was the third possibility that their analysts had identified. The war might never end. Two evenly matched alliances could grind each other down for millennia, consuming everything in their path while neither achieved victory. In that scenario, humanity's future looked very dark indeed. Dr. Chun, now heading the newly formed Department of Xenocultural Analysis, stood to present her findings. "We've made significant progress in understanding the alien mindstates through their communications intercepts. Both sides appear to be locked in what we might call technological tunnel vision. They're so focused on matching each other's advances that they've lost sight of fundamentally different approaches to warfare." She gestured to the holographic display, highlighting battle formations. "Look at their tactics. Despite involving dozens of species with presumably different ways of thinking, they've all adopted remarkably similar strategies. Large fleets engaging in direct confrontation, technology countering technology in an endless cycle of one-upmanship." The Chinese representative, Admiral Wei Jiang, studied the formations with a military eye. "It's like they're all playing the same game, just with different pieces. But what if someone introduced entirely different rules?" This question had been at the heart of human military planning since the discovery. Earth's greatest strategic minds had been tasked with finding humanity's edge. They couldn't match the aliens. Technology, civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia, had advantages humanity couldn't hope to replicate quickly. But perhaps they didn't need to play by the established rules. Colonel James Rodriguez, the youngest person in the room at 35, had been quiet throughout most of the briefing. As head of the Special Warfare Development Group, he'd been working on humanity's most unconventional military project. Now he cleared his throat and activated his own holographic display. "What if the reason this war has lasted so long isn't just because both sides are evenly matched," he said, "but because they're both wrong about how wars are won?" The display showed human military history, from ancient tribal conflicts to modern peacekeeping operations. Every civilization represented in this galactic war seems to focus on the same basic principle: build bigger, better weapons and deploy them in massive confrontations. It's a very Direct approach? He paused, letting that sink in. Humans develop differently. We learned early that wars aren't just won by superior firepower. They're won by superior thinking, by finding the enemy's weakness and exploiting it in ways they never expected. The Secretary General, Maria Santos, looked skeptical. Colonel, are you suggesting that humanity's military tradition of guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics could somehow affect a conflict on this scale? Rodriguez smiled. Not affect, Madame Secretary, end. Over the following months, humanity's response took shape in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Rather than building massive battle fleets, Earth's shipyards produced small, stealthy vessels designed for infiltration and intelligence gathering. Instead of developing superweapons, human scientists focused on understanding the psychological and social structures of the warring civilizations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a behavioral economist studying game theory applications, realized that the Galactic War had developed into what she called a stability trap. Both sides had become so invested in the conflict that ending it successfully had become less important than ensuring the other side didn't win. It's like a poker game where both players have bet everything they own, she explained to the strategy committee. Neither can fold because they'd lose everything, but neither has a winning hand. So they keep raising the stakes, hoping the other will break first. This insight led to humanity's most audacious plan. Rather than trying to join one side or the other, rather than attempting to overpower both alliances, humanity would do something no one in the galaxy expected. They would change the game entirely, the first human vessels to enter. Galactic space were unlike anything the warring civilizations had ever encountered. They were small, barely larger than shuttlecraft by galactic standards, and they appeared completely unarmed. When Karathi patrol ships intercepted the first human vessel, they found something that confused them profoundly. Commander Yekska examined the strange craft through his viewscreen. It was clearly artificial, but its design made no sense. No visible weapons, minimal armor, and it had actually broadcast its location rather than trying to hide. When his attempts at communication received a response in perfect Karathi, his confusion deepened. "This is Captain Sarah McKay of the Earth vessel Olive Branch," came the transmission. "We come in peace and wish to speak with your leadership about ending this war." Ending the war? Yekska's tactical implants struggled to process this concept. Victories were achieved through superior firepower. Defeats were suffered when that firepower failed. But ending a war? That happened when side was utterly destroyed. This human spoke of it as if it were something that could be simply decided. Similar encounters were happening throughout both Alliance territories. Small human ships appeared without warning, identified themselves, and requested meetings with commanders. They showed no hostile intent, made no territorial claims, and seemed completely unconcerned about being vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Admiral Vexstar received the report about the human contact with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Intelligence indicated that these humans were a recently spacefaring species from an uncharted region of the galaxy. They appeared to have no alliance with either the Karathi or the Zilani, which should have made them potential allies. But their stated goal of ending the war suggested either dangerous naivety or some kind of elaborate deception. "Bring their representative to the fleet," he ordered. "I want to understand what they're really after." Commander Zaranith made the same decision on the Zilani side. These humans were an unknown factor in a war that had become depressingly predictable. At minimum, they represented potential intelligence about new technologies or tactics. At best, they might become valuable allies. When Captain McKay arrived aboard the Karathi flagship, she brought with her something that no one in either alliance had seen for 2 centuries, a genuine peace proposal. Not demands for surrender, not negotiations for temporary ceasefire, but an actual plan for ending the hostilities permanently. The fundamental problem. McKay explained to Admiral Vexstar, through a translation device that somehow provided perfect Karathi with appropriate cultural context, is that you're both trying to win a war that can't be won. Your technologies are too evenly matched, your resources too vast, your determination too great. You could fight for 1,000 years and still reach no decisive conclusion. Vexstar's scaled features showed skepticism. And you believe your species, which has never faced an enemy like the Zilani, can succeed where we have failed? McKay shook her head. Admiral, we're not here to fight your war. We're here to show you that there's a third option. You can choose to end it. The concept was so foreign that Vexstar's translation device struggled with it. Choose to end a war? Wars ended when one side achieved victory or suffered defeat. They didn't simply stop because someone chose to stop them, but over the following weeks, as human representatives met with leaders from both alliances, a strange thing began to happen. For the first time in centuries, military commanders found themselves discussing something other than the next battle or the latest weapon development. They were talking about what would happen after the war ended. Captain David Park, meeting with the Zilani War Council, asked questions that no one had considered in living memory. What did your people want before this war began? What would they do if peace returned? What would your children grow up to become? The Korathi battle fleet hung in space like a constellation of death, their obsidian hulls reflecting the dying light of 3 suns. Admiral Vexstar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display with growing frustration. Red dots representing enemy vessels moved in predictable patterns across the holographic battlefield, while blue markers showed his own forces locked in the same grinding stalemate that had defined this war for the past 2 centuries. The Galactic Civil War had begun as a simple territorial dispute between the Korathi Empire and the Zilani Federation. 2 massive civilizations, each controlling hundreds of star systems, had disagreed over mining rights in a distant nebula. What started as diplomatic protests had escalated into skirmishes, then full battles, and finally into the largest conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. Now, 47 different species had chosen sides, splitting the known galaxy into 2 massive alliances. Vexstar's communication officer, a young Korathi with purple scales that betrayed his nervousness, approached the command platform. Admiral, we're receiving reports from the front lines. The Zilani have deployed their new plasma cannons again. The Third Fleet is requesting immediate reinforcement. The Admiral's tail lashed with irritation. The Zilani plasma cannons were a technological marvel that could cut through Korathi armor like it was made of paper. In response, his people had developed quantum shielding that could deflect the plasma bursts. The Zilani had then created shield-piercing missiles. The Korathi answered with point defense networks. And so it continued, each side matching the other's innovations, ensuring that no advantage lasted more than a few months. Tell the Third Fleet to hold position, Vexstar ordered. Deploy the resonance disruptors. That should neutralize their plasma advantage for now. Across the battlefield, aboard the Zilani command ship Starlight's Edge, Fleet Commander Zaraneth faced the same frustrating reality. Her people's superior technology was being constantly matched by Korathi ingenuity. Every breakthrough her scientists achieved was somehow countered within weeks. The war had become a grinding contest of attrition, consuming resources and lives at a staggering rate. Commander, her tactical advisor spoke through the telepathic link all Zilani shared. The latest casualty reports are coming in. We've lost another 300 vessels in today's engagement alone. Our shipyards are barely keeping pace with losses. Zaranith's crystalline features remained impassive, though inside she felt the weight of every lost life. The Zilani were a peaceful species by nature, forced into this conflict by Korathi aggression. At least that's what their propaganda claimed. She sometimes wondered if the Korathi told their soldiers the same thing about her people. The scope of the Galactic War had grown beyond anything either side had originally imagined. What had begun as a conflict between 2 species now involved dozens of civilizations. The insectoid Vexstar had allied with the Korathi, bringing their swarm tactics and bioships. The energy beings known as the Lumina had sided with the Zilani, contributing their mastery over electromagnetic warfare. Ancient species like the rock-like granite lords and the aquatic Merton had emerged from isolation to join the fight. Each species brought their own unique technologies and fighting styles. The Vecthar bred living ships that could repair themselves and adapt mid-battle. The Lumina could phase in and out of normal space, making them nearly impossible to track. The Granite Lords built fortress ships with armor so thick that conventional weapons were useless against them. The Merton used water-based technologies that seemed impossible to other species but proved devastatingly effective. Yet for all this diversity in tactics and technology, the war remained deadlocked. Every advantage was quickly countered. Every breakthrough was matched by the opposing side. Battle lines shifted constantly but never decisively. Star systems changed hands regularly, only to be recaptured months later. The galaxy had become a vast chessboard where neither player could achieve checkmate. The economic cost was staggering. Entire civilizations had converted their economies to war production. Trade routes that had existed for millennia were disrupted or destroyed. Neutral species found themselves forced to choose sides or face conquest by whichever alliance considered them strategically valuable. The great cultural exchanges that had defined galactic civilization for thousands of years came to a halt as xenophobia and suspicion replaced cooperation on the planet Nexus Prime. Traditionally neutral ground where diplomats from all species had once gathered. The last peace negotiations had failed spectacularly 6 months ago. The conference hall where the talks took place still bore scorch marks from when the Korathi delegation accused the Zilani of poisoning their water supply, leading to a brief but intense firefight between the security teams. Ambassador Cathrian of the Neutral Covenant sat in her empty office, reviewing intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The Covenant represented the few dozen species that had managed to remain out of the conflict, but even they were feeling the pressure. Refugees flooded their borders daily. Their trade networks were collapsing. Some of her own people were beginning to suggest that neutrality was no longer sustainable. The projections are getting worse, her aide, a soft-spoken member of the Peaceful Harmony Collective, reported. Our analysts believe that at current rates of escalation, the war could last another 500 years. Maybe more. 500 years. Cathrian shuddered at the thought. Entire generations had already been born and died knowing nothing but war. How many more would suffer the same fate? Meanwhile, on research stations scattered throughout both alliances, scientists worked frantically to develop the weapon that would finally tip the balance. The Korathi were experimenting with temporal manipulation, hoping to slow their enemies' ships to a crawl. The Zilani pursued dimensional warfare, attempting to banish enemy fleets to parallel realities. Every few months, rumors would spread of a miraculous discovery, only for hopes to be dashed when the technology proved impractical or was somehow countered by the enemy. The war had taken on a life of its own. Generals who had started as young officers were now ancient veterans, having spent their entire careers fighting the same enemy. Entire military academies taught only warfare, producing officers who knew nothing but conflict. Peace had become a foreign concept, something that existed only in historical texts and the dreams of the very old dot in the deep space between star systems. Automated factories churned out warships around the clock. Asteroid belts were stripped bare to feed the endless hunger for raw materials. Entire planets had been converted into fortress worlds, their surfaces covered in defensive installations and military bases. The cultural impact was equally devastating. Art and literature focused obsessively on themes of war and sacrifice. Music had become martial, with complex harmonies replaced by simple, driving rhythms meant to inspire troops. Scientific research had been completely militarized, with every discovery evaluated solely on its potential military applications, but perhaps most troubling was how normal it had all become. Young Korathi and Zilani spoke of battlefield tactics with the same casual familiarity that their ancestors had once discussed weather. Children played games that simulated space battles with disturbing accuracy. The war wasn't just something happening to them anymore. It had become who they were. Deep in the unexplored regions of the galaxy's outer rim, far from the established trade routes and the noise of war, something unprecedented was happening. A small, Blue-green planet orbited an unremarkable yellow star in a system that no galactic cartographer had ever bothered to catalog. The planet's inhabitants had recently achieved faster-than-light communication, and were beginning to detect the electromagnetic signatures of the massive battles raging thousands of light-years away. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the control room of the Arecibo Deep Space Array, studying the strange signals her team had been tracking for weeks. The patterns were clearly artificial, showing signs of organization and purpose that no natural phenomenon could explain. More disturbing still, the signals suggested massive energy discharges on a scale that seemed almost impossible. "Professor," her graduate student Marcus called from across the room, "you need to see this." The computers finished analyzing the signal patterns. It's identifying distinct technological signatures. Hundreds of them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The implications were staggering. If these signals represented technology, then they were evidence of not just one alien civilization, but dozens. And the energy levels suggested that these civilizations were engaged in some kind of massive conflict within weeks. Every major government on Earth had been briefed on the discovery. Emergency sessions were called in the United Nations. Military leaders demanded immediate action to prepare for potential invasion. Scientists argued for caution and further study. Politicians debated whether the information should be released to the public, but even as Earth's leaders struggled to process this revelation, the galaxy's oldest war continued to rage. Neither the Korathi nor the Zelani had any idea that they were being watched by a species that had never known interstellar warfare, a civilization that had spent its entire development learning to solve problems through cooperation rather than conflict. The galaxy was